Good evening again, everybody. We're picking up in chapter 9 of the Imagination Station Voyage with the Vikings. And if you missed any of our weeks, we've done 2 weeks of this book club so far. The links to those other ones are down in the description below. So if you missed a couple of chapters, you can go back and listen to those with me. And you can either just listen along, or you can grab your copy of the book either from your local library or from Amazon or a bookstore. Used bookstore would be great too. We're in chapter 9 tonight, and I'll just give you like a reminder of what's happening. So Beth and Patrick are cousins, and they took the Imagination Station time machine and they went back in time, and they met up with some Vikings, and it was like scary for a minute because this one Viking, Eric, did not seem to like them, and his son Leif helped them hide in his mother's house. So now Patrick has decided to go follow some of the Vikings onto the ship and try to search for the sunstone. They're trying to find a sunstone. And I don't know if you noticed this picture. I'm just going to show it again. This picture here shows something that I think is very interesting, and I kind of raised my eyebrows at what I see there. So I don't know if you noticed it too, but I have a feeling that's going to come up again. I haven't read this before, so I'm reading it for the first time with you. So we'll see. I don't know. Chapter 9, The Thief. Patrick looked up from the chest of furs. Everyone was staring at Patrick. "Captain," said the sailor, "a boy is stealing furs." The sailor came up to him. He grabbed the edge of Patrick's silver cape. "Look," he said, "he stole this fur cape." "It's not what you think," Patrick said. "This is mine." The men gathered around. Some of them pulled out knives. "Wait," a voice said. Leif pushed through the crowd. The sailor took a step back from Patrick. Relief washed over Patrick. He looked up at Leif. "I'm sorry," Patrick said. "I just wanted to see what was inside. I didn't take anything. I promise." Leif said to his sailors, "I'll deal with the boy. The day's work is done. You may all go. But be here before dawn tomorrow." A cheer went up among the men. They ran down the plank to shore. "Where is the girl?" Leif asked Patrick. "Is she safe?" "I left her at the church," Patrick said. "Where you should be," Leif said. "Don't you understand what will happen now?" "No," Patrick said. "The people are going to the last feast before we sail," Leif said. "Great," Patrick said. "I love parties." "This party is not for you. They worship the Norse gods like Thor. They offer sacrifices." We know about sacrifices. And we also know about fake gods, don't we? Patrick gasped. "Idol worship?" he asked. Leif frowned at him. "That is why I wanted you and the girl to stay inside the church. It is the only place where you'll be safe." Patrick took a deep breath. What if Beth had left the church? What if Eric caught her and took her to the ceremony? "We have to go back to Beth," he said. "Hurry!" Patrick raced from the boat and back to the village. Leif followed close behind. They reached the church. Patrick threw open the door. "Beth!" he shouted. But there was no answer. Chapter 10, The Feast. "Come with me to the longhouse," Leif said to Patrick. "The feast will be held there." Maybe someone took her inside. They ran across the village. The longhouse was much larger than the church. Patrick stuck his head through the doorway and looked around. The big room was filled with men and women. A gray haze hung like fog. It was hard for Patrick to see. He coughed and wondered what caused the smoke. Then he saw fire blazing in a fire ring. It was at the center of the room. Some of the smoke escaped through a small hole in the roof, but most of the smoke filled the room. No one seemed to notice. Patrick saw a huge metal pot hanging over the fire. He thought it looked like a witch's cauldron. The Norsemen and Norse women sat on long wooden benches. They ate roasted fish and meat, and they drank from wooden cups. A group of men played bone pipes and wood drums. Young teen boys and girls sang happy songs. Others danced nearby. Patrick moved slowly among the crowd. He searched for Beth. A few men were playing board games. Eric the Red was playing a game against another man. Next to Eric was Hilda. Next to Hilda was Beth. Patrick couldn't believe it. There she was, sitting on a bench. A small crowd moved in to watch Eric and the man play. Beth saw Patrick and came over to him. "What are you doing here?" Patrick asked. "After you left, Hilda came to the church to check on me," Beth whispered. "Eric was with her." "What happened?" Patrick asked. "Eric ordered me to help cook," Beth said. "He wants me to learn to be a house slave. That way he can sell me for more money." "But you're not cooking now," Patrick said. Hilda got upset, Beth said. "Eric isn't afraid of any man, but he's afraid of Hilda. She said she would keep me safe. I've been next to her ever since." "What game is Eric playing?" Patrick asked. "Chess. It's his favorite game," Beth said. "But no one likes to play him." "Why not?" Patrick asked. "Because they're afraid of what he'll do if he loses," she said. Patrick pointed to Eric's sword. The yellow jewel in the handle gleamed. "I think that might be the sunstone, but I wish I could get a closer look." "I wouldn't try," Beth said. Suddenly, Eric slapped the table. Patrick and Beth jumped. The chess pieces bounced around on the board. "Checkmate," he shouted. The man who lost stood up, bowed, and walked away. "Who will play me next?" Eric shouted. No one answered. He stood up and looked around. He saw Patrick. As he stared at Patrick's cape, his eyes narrowed. "Do you play, boy?" Eric asked Patrick. "No, sir," Patrick said. "What about you?" Eric asked Beth. Yes, she said. Patrick was surprised. "You do?" he asked. Beth opened the small sack Mr. Whitaker had given her. She dumped the red and white chess pieces onto the table. Eric picked up the colored pieces. They seemed bright compared to the plain pieces he used. "Sit down," Eric said. "But I don't think I'm good enough to play a grown-up," Beth said. "Sit down," Eric said. It was an order. Beth obeyed and sat across from him. She looked scared. "A wager for our game," Eric said. "If I win, I will get the boy's silver cape." "What does she get if she wins?" Patrick asked. "You may keep your lives," Eric said. The people in the crowd laughed. Hilda stood up. "That's not fair, my husband," she said. "If she wins, she should get something." Eric groaned. "You are too kind to slaves. What does this girl want?" Beth looked helpless. "I don't know," she said. Patrick cleared his throat loudly. Beth looked at him. Patrick tilted his head toward Eric's sword. "Oh, I know," Beth said. "If you win, you get the silver cape. If I win, I get your sword." The crowd suddenly went quiet. Eric looked puzzled. "My sword?" "Child," Hilda said kindly, "that sword is a family treasure." "What would you do with this sword?" Eric asked. "It is too big for you." "I would keep it to remember you by," Beth said. Eric smiled. It seemed as if he liked to be liked. Patrick stepped forward. He said to Eric, "If you're afraid you'll lose—" "Lose? I never lose," Eric said. He pounded the table with his fist. He leaned toward Beth. "I accept your challenge," he said. Patrick watched as the pieces were arranged. Beth used the white ones. Eric used the red ones. Her hands looked very small compared to the Vikings. The game lasted a long time. Patrick paced. He saw Leaf watching them closely. Eric was a smart player, but so was Beth. After an hour, only 9 pieces were left on the board. Beth had 3 pawns, a bishop, and her king. Eric had 1 pawn, a rook, his queen, and his king. "We can stop now," Eric said to Beth. "You can see that I have better pieces than you do. The cape is as good as mine." "We'll see," Beth said. Eric picked up his queen. He plunked it down near Beth's king. "Check," he said. Eric then looked at Patrick. "Give me the silver cape, boy," he said. Patrick frowned. He began to take off the cape. "Wait, Patrick," Beth said. "Not so fast." She picked up a pawn. It was the smallest and weakest piece on the board. She moved it one space forward. The move blocked Eric's queen. "Checkmate," she said. Eric glared at the board. "How did you do that?" he roared. Hilda laughed. "She has also trapped you," she said, "with a little pawn." "She must have cheated," he shouted. "I cannot be beaten by a little girl." The crowd shrank back from him. They were afraid of what he might do. Hilda put a hand on his shoulder. "My husband. The girl won fairly," she said calmly. Eric stood up. His face turned a deep red with anger. "No!" he howled. He pulled his sword out of the holder. Arm straight, he held it in the air. His arms started to tremble with rage. "Remember your honor," Hilda said softly. Bam! Eric threw the sword down on the table and then turned and pushed through the crowd. One by one, the Vikings around the game table left. Most of them followed Eric to the fire ring. The musicians began to play again. Beth thought it would feel good to be Eric, but she felt sad as she put the chess pieces back in her sack. Winning the sword didn't seem right somehow. Leif came over to them. "That was a risky thing to do. What will you do with the sword?" "It isn't for us to keep," Patrick said. "Oh," Leif said. He lifted an eyebrow in surprise. "Though I always wanted a sword," Patrick said. "And this one was beautiful." He picked it up from the table. It was heavy. He looked at the jewel. Mr. Whitaker would be so pleased to see it. He then used both hands to slide the sword into his belt. Hilda came up behind the cousins. She put one hand on each of their shoulders. "It's time for us to leave," she said. "You have warned the other Christians?" Leif asked her. She nodded. "Warned them about what?" Beth asked. "The sacrifices to the gods are about to begin," Hilda replied. Beth and Patrick turned to look at the fire ring. Many of the Viking men and women were now dancing around it. Cups were in their hands. They threw liquid on the fire. "What are they doing?" Beth asked Leif. "They are throwing beer into the fire," Leif said, "as a sacrifice to a false god." The fire hissed and flared. The yellow light cast a strange glow on everything. A deep sadness crossed over Leif's face. "My mother is right," he said. "This is no place for Christians or children." Chapter 11. The Full Moon. Leif, Hilda, and the cousins left the longhouse. So did a few of the men and women. As the Norse Christians walked toward their homes, they bid Leif and Hilda good night. Beth breathed in the fresh air of the village courtyard. She looked up at the sky. Wispy green lights danced like smoke in the wind. "What's that?" Patrick asked. "I've seen it on TV. It's called the Northern Lights," Beth whispered to Patrick. It was the fourth amazing thing she had seen in Greenland. The moon was full. It cast a white glow over the village. The moon reminded her of the note from inside the imagination station. "I need a Viking sunstone before the new moon." Beth pulled on Leif's sleeve. "When is the new moon?" she asked. Leif stroked his blonde beard. "What manner of girl are you?" he said. "You know chess, but you don't know the moon is in 14 days. Come, I will show you the sunstone. It will teach you about the sky." Patrick and Beth both gasped. Patrick put a hand on the hilt of the sword. "Isn't this yellow jewel the sunstone?" Leif laughed. "No," he said. "What made you think it was?" "Just a guess," Patrick said sadly. "So where is the real sunstone?" Leif led them to a huge rock in the corner of the village. The sunstone was taller than Beth. It had symbols, holes, and lines carved all over it. "We use the sunstone to mark the seasons," Leif said. "It also points us southward." Leif knelt down by the rock. He took Patrick's hand and placed it on the sunstone. "Feel that arrow mark?" Leif asked. Patrick nodded. "At noon the sun passes over that mark," Leif said. "Then the sunstone casts a shadow. We mark where the shadow falls here." Leif dragged his finger across the ground. Beth and Patrick followed his motion. Several flat rocks surrounded the sunstone. Symbols and holes were carved into the rocks as well. When the noon sun reaches these slash marks, Leaf said, we know it is spring. We can sail. Can the sunstone be moved away from Greenland? Beth asked. Leaf looked at Beth. Of course not, he said. This stone will only work in this place. My people rely on it. Beth turned to Patrick. She whispered, now what are we supposed to do? We're going to stop there tonight, everybody, and next week we're going to actually finish the book. We're going to start in chapter 12, and we're going to go all the way to the end. Hang on tight for a couple of really important announcements that I want to make sure you and your parents know about. Have a good night, everybody. See you tomorrow at church.